on paper. And okay, good. Okay. Works on paper, and joining her in conversation are artists Julie Wolfe and Nekisha Durrett, both of whom live and work in the DC area. Laura Roulet is an independent curator and writer specializing in contemporary and Latin American art. She was one of the 5 international curators chosen for the initial 5x5, a major public art initiative in Washington, DC. Her most recent exhibitions include Mothering in a World Turned Upside Down at Brentwood Arts Exchange in Maryland, Landscape in an Eroded Field, Ian Yala, Dynamical Systems, and Funsham, Escape, all 3 at the American University Museum, the Katzen Center. A dark and scandalous rock fall at the Mexican Cultural Institute, as well as exhibits at the Huntington Museum of Art in West Virginia and at the National Drawing Invitational at the Arkansas Art Center in Little Rock. Laura also worked on the Ana Mendieta retrospective at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. International exhibitions include the OAS Art Museum and Sculpture Garden, at the Art Museum of the Americas, as well as exhibits in Mexico City and Puerto Rico. She is a regular contributor to Sculpture Magazine and has written many catalog essays and articles in leading art publications. Julie Wolfe is a multimedia artist whose work visualizes the diffuse, the immaterial, and the invisible. Though her art is grounded in real reference as diverse as environment degradation, human communication, and scientific data, the resulting works expand into new realms and modes of perception, taking the form of imaginary landscapes and fundamentally unreal spaces. Born in Dallas, Texas, Julie received her BFA in painting and art history at the University of Texas in Austin in 1986. After a move to Washington, DC, she has become one of the most influential and prolific artists in the area. She had a major retrospective at the American University Museum Katzen Center in 2017, and has had many solo and group exhibitions throughout the US and abroad. Represented by Hemphill Fine Arts in DC, her latest solo exhibition, Wildfires and Dreamfields, was held at the gallery in 2020. Her book, Wildfires and Dreamfields, will be on view at the National Gallery of Art Library in late June. Her upcoming exhibitions include Seeing Again, opening on May 29th at Jinja in Tokyo, Japan, The Color of Light, opening July 2nd at the Mark Rothko Center in Latvia, New Prints, opening June 12th at the International Print Center in New York, Unbound, opening July 2nd at the Candela Gallery in Richmond, Virginia, and a solo exhibition of her work is on view at the Page Bond Gallery in Richmond until June 7th. Her work is in many private and public collections, including the National Gallery of Art, Library, New York Public Library, Metropolitan Museum of Art Library, and the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and the American University Museum, among many more. Nekisha Durrett is a mixed media artist who employs the visual language of mass media to bring forward histories that objects, places, and words embody, but are not often celebrated. Her expansive practice includes public art, social practice, installation, murals, painting, sculpture, and design. Nekisha is invested in foregrounding issues of Black life while creating a space where fantasy, imagination, and history can converge. She earned her BFA at the Cooper Union in New York City and MFA from the University of Michigan School of Art and Design, where she was a Horace H. Rackham Fellow. Nekisha has exhibited her work throughout the DC area and nationally. She is currently a finalist in the National Portrait Gallery's prestigious Outwin Bochever Portrait Competition and is featured in the Outwin 2019 American Portraiture Today exhibition. Her many installations include a permanent installation on the grass-walled vestibule in the newly renovated Martin Luther King Jr. Library in DC, opening to the public in June. Magnolia, a series of leaves perforated, with the names of women murdered by law enforcement, was on view in her solo exhibition at the Cody Gallery at Marymount University and the Atlanta Biennial at Atlanta Contemporary. Future projects include a site-specific public installation at the Phillips Collection in August, a group show, Shoulder the Deed, at Stable in DC, opening in June, a permanent large-scale installation at Metropolitan Park in Arlington, Virginia in 2022-23. So please join me in a warm and virtual welcome to our three participants. Thank you. Laura? Laura, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Trying to share my screen. Oh, there we go. All right. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I wish we could be doing this in person, but we will have to deal with Zoom a little bit longer. Today I'm going to be talking about how my husband and I, Rafael Hernandez, have been building on my parent collection, Anne and Norman Roulet, who lived in Cleveland. That's where I grew up. So I'm starting with the Cleveland artist, Julian Stanczak. I think that he's gaining more recognition now, but had just an amazing life. You can read about his life on his website or Wikipedia. He was in the sort of defining exhibits of op art at Martha Jackson Gallery, the Responsive Eye at MoMA. And then he chose to make his career in Cleveland and taught at the Cleveland Institute of Art for about as long as my mother was on the faculty. She was an English professor and dean of students at the Cleveland Institute of Art for about 35 years. So one of her criteria, or one of her priorities as a collector, was to support her faculty members, her colleagues, and students as well. So we have many works by Julian Stanczak, and this happens to be the print that was in my bedroom as I was growing up. So for most of my childhood, I got to enjoy this print, and I didn't realize that it had been donated to the Cleveland Museum of Art until a few years ago when I was visiting there, and I turned a corner and saw something very familiar. But I'm happy that it's in a public institution and that others will be able to enjoy it now. So the new gallery was founded in Cleveland in 1968. And this is another place that my parents would purchase art and help to build a contemporary art community in Cleveland. It was founded, it was a commercial gallery created by Nina Sundell and Marjorie Talalay. Nina Sundell is the daughter of Leo Castelli and Elena Sonnabend. So she also grew up surrounded by incredible contemporary art. One of her backers of the new gallery was a young woman collector, then known by the name of Agnes Sawfield, her first married name, now known by Aggie Gund. So Aggie is a collector beloved by many, and certainly a role model for me as a collector. She grew up in Cleveland as well and was an incredible booster for local artists, women artists, as well as, international. She started her collection while she was still in Cleveland. I was actually a babysitter for her 4 rambunctious children, one of whom grew up to be a filmmaker, Catherine Gund, who is the one who made the wonderful movie Aggie, which I would encourage everyone to watch. I think it's still on, Amazon or something like that. But Aggie was someone that sort of indicated to me that collecting art can be a form of social change and even of social justice. So this is an early portfolio that my parents bought. It may have come from the New Gallery. It's the type of art that they would have been able to buy at the New Gallery. It's in many museum collections, including MoMA's, which has used the Liechtenstein explosion as sort of a marketing, icon. We still have the Wilhelm de Kooning clam digger, which is one of my favorites. So collecting a portfolio is always kind of a grab bag. You're not going to like all of the prints equally. Not all of them will appreciate in value, but it's a way to build a collection and sometimes to support institutions. Another way that my parents assembled many prints was through the Cleveland Print Club. So the Cleveland Print Club was the first museum affiliate group in the United States. It was founded in 1919, and its main purpose at first was to buy work on paper for the Cleveland Museum of Art. They also promoted the collecting of prints. They had an educational function. Then they decided pretty quickly that they would create a tradition of having an annual commissioned print for members. So the membership quickly grew. They capped it at 250 members. So most of the editions are of 250 prints. And you had to inherit a membership. Someone had to die before you could become a member. But my parents were members for 50 years, and we have inherited some wonderful prints. The Bridget Riley is one of my favorites. And the April Gornick is also one of my mother's favorite students. So April grew up in Cleveland. She went to the Cleveland Institute of Art. She continues to contribute to the Cleveland art community. And this is sort of typical of the type of artist that my mother would want to continue to support. So this is an interesting portfolio to me. It's collected as a book and also as a print portfolio. So it's a kind of circular project that it was a tribute to John Ashbery, the poet, who was inspired by the Renaissance portrait that you see in the center there by Parmigianino. So it's a poem inspired by a portrait, and then 8 artists were commissioned to create artwork, which Ashbery, I guess, saw as illustrations, but I see as important prints. It was very carefully kind of designed and packaged in this stainless steel canister that has a convex mirror in the center. And the prints are sort of vary a lot in subject matter. So on the far left, you see Elaine de Kooning's response to this prompt. She chose to make a portrait of John Ashbery, the poet. Next to her is Jane Freilicher, who did a very typical work, a still life. And that could be interpreted maybe as a conceptual self-portrait or as a response to the imagery of the poem. Next to that is Alex Katz, who did a very typical portrait of his favorite muse, his beautiful wife, Ada. And on the other side is Wilhelm de Kooning, who created a work on a sort of clock face. And I can only assume that he intentionally left the numbers reversed. So I think almost all of these are lithographs. And the whole portfolio includes an LP. So that's what we see in the center there. If you still have a turntable, you can actually listen to John Ashbery reading his own poem. So this is another portfolio that my husband and I bought to support a really important nonprofit in New York called Exit Art. So Exit Art was founded by Puerto Rican artist Papo Colo and his partner Jeanette Ingerman in 1982. It was first located downtown in Soho on West Broadway. And it was founded as an alternative art space, primarily to show the work of marginalized and under-recognized artists. A lot of Latinx and artists of color launched their careers through group shows at Exit Art. They later moved uptown to Hell's Kitchen, and in 1995 got the idea of creating an annual portfolio to raise funds for the space. And all of the portfolios were sort of composed the same way, that they invited established artists. So this was the 2000 portfolio and includes people like Sol LeWitt, Louise Bourgeois, who would have been, obviously well known at the time. But they also included emerging artists, under-recognized artists, sometimes even young, unknown artists. So at this time, Julie Maritou, you see a detail of her work on the right. Carrie James Marshall, whose print is at the bottom, were very under-recognized at that time. And so these portfolios, which were collected by museums and some important collectors, were a way of kind of slyly integrating print collections. So you might have bought it because you wanted the Sol LeWitt, but you also got Julie Maritou and Shazia Sikander and Carrie James Marshall. This is what the Sol LeWitt looks like, still hanging in our living room. And this is the most recent portfolio that my husband and I have bought to support another nonprofit. It's a budding space in San Juan, Puerto Rico. My husband is using his legal skills pro bono to help them become a 501(c)(3). It's founded by two artists, Charles Juhas Alvarado and Ana Rosa Rivera. So I think inspired by Exit Art, they had the idea of, during the shutdown, creating a small portfolio to raise funds for their space. And Laura and Calzadia, who are well-known artists as a duo, they have become kind of honorary Puerto Ricans, and their main studio is in San Juan. They represented the US and Puerto Rico in the Venice Biennale. They've shown around the world. That's Guillermo Calzadia on the left there. Neither of them were born in Puerto Rico, but they've become honorary Puerto Ricans. So he's signing his print that you see on the right. And this is the other print that's in the portfolio by Ignacio Lang, also a Puerto Rican. And this is a kind of interesting print. I would say they both have ecological themes. Sort of climate change is one concern of all the artists. He invents this sort of mythology around what looks like a newspaper article. So Colón y la ballena would mean it could be translated as Columbus and the whale. So he's kind of referencing Jonah and the whale. There's a sort of shifting of who's being rescued, who does the rescuing. There's a political undercurrent. So they're both really interesting prints, and we bought them basically, sight unseen to support this space, Casa de los Contrafuertes. So another priority for me as a collector is to support local talent here in the Washington, D.C. area. And Julie Wolfe was one of those artists that when I saw her retrospective or her solo show at American University, I knew immediately that I wanted to live with her work. And then it was just a question of finding the right work. So this was the right work for me because it is a monoprint on vintage maps. It is obviously references Rorschach prints, and my father was a psychiatrist. So I don't know if he used Rorschach ink blots in his practice, but it refers back to the time when he was training as a psychoanalyst. And he was also very much interested in science. And the maps happen to cover the areas where I have lived almost my entire life. So the northern map includes the Great Lakes and Cleveland. And the southern map includes the Atlantic seaboard. So Maryland is there, and also it goes down to the Caribbean. So Julie is going to tell us a bit more about the series and about some of her artist books. Yes.
Thanks, Laura. It's nice to be here, and thank you all for coming, listening. So these pieces that Laura's talking about, this is another one that was part of that series, and they're entitled "Under Their Gaze, We Become Creatures." This is part of an exhibition that was in 2019 at Hemphill, and there's been a lot of talk lately, I think, about alternative ways of printing, and Laura and I kind of talked about this yesterday, it being a monoprint, and how the ink is applied to a surface and then transferred onto another surface by pressure, and then you get an impression, in this case a symmetrical impression, and so I like the idea of calling this a print instead of just painting ink onto a surface. I like to use material that's found or already existing images so that I can respond off of those with my work. Okay. Here's a shot in my studio. So you can see these are photographs that I've taken from different sources, merged them and distorted them, and then had them printed with archivally onto large sheets of arches. And then I usually paint the surface and start to form the shape. These are made by multiple foldings, letting paint dry and then adding more. Okay. Some of the shapes have a little bit more of an ominous presence, and they ask questions about perception and the subconscious mind. When I was making these, it was my goal to create a space for folks to contemplate within their own frame of reference what confronts them, to ask questions like, what am I compelled by? What do I see in this image? And I also want people, and they seems like they almost automatically respond to this by looking for a shape or trying to find something that they can identify within the Rorschach space or shape. And so I found that that's usually what happens, and each person is different, you know, with what they see and what they find interesting about the piece. And I really like that. Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. So as I'm making these, you can tell it's kind of a haphazard process. And so I usually end up making multiple test prints. Using book pages, which is what I do a lot of, also images and just scraps of paper. So many times I end up using these for something else, but it's important to do because it's a way for me to find like what parts of the image I want to expose and how the paint reacts to the fibers of the paper, how the colors react with each other, and eventually I get an idea of what's working, and then I'll move on to do a larger piece. Okay. In conjunction with the exhibition Under Their Gaze, We Become Creatures, I had a folio made, an edition of 1,000, and it was oversized and was supposed to be kind of an unfolding of a dream or a dreamscape. So it wasn't necessarily an exhibition catalog with text, it was just images. And I was using photographic images and the artwork so that there would be this sort of random image association between facing pages. Okay. And so out of that, in 2020, I started this other project, and I decided the previous book wasn't representing the kind of dreams that we were having during this intense time. So I decided to take that book and deconstruct it and overprint all of the images in the book to make them much more vivid and intense. I started talking to people about what dreams they were having during this time and what kind of dream imagery and dream logic and things that were reoccurring in their dreams. It's very interesting. And so I was using this imagery to screen print over these pages. So this was an edition of 5 special editions, and then I made an edition of 20 smaller, and later on some print editions as well. Okay. I worked on this all summer at Pyramid Atlantic, and made multiple screens for the front and back of each page. And then there are also fold out pages and sub pages within the book. Okay. These are some test prints just to give you an idea of what I was doing. The original book and screen printing over those pages. But at the same time doing that, I like for the new imagery to relate to what's underneath in some way. So on most of the pages and page spreads, you can see the previous image and then how that has changed over time with what was currently happening. Okay. And here are some page spreads from the book. And, you know, if you look closely at these, you can see some of the under images and what's going on there. And so, yeah, this was an interesting project. And I'm now considering the next stage of this as we go forward. Okay. And here's another spread from it as well. You can see the pulled out pages. Okay. And then, so this is the next printing project that I've been doing. I guess you could call it kind of a re-entry project. I've always been fascinated with old travel publications and brochures, and especially how the color always seems to be so exaggerated. And the ones that I use are usually between the 40s and 50s, 60s. And I take images and change them around and have them printed archivally as well. But I've always been interested in how the colors being so exaggerated, it's almost as if they're being exaggerated to lure people in to visit this destination. So I think of them as kind of like destinations that don't exist or some sort of counter world. And so I decided to print over these with lines of color and geometric figures to kind of mask out part of the landscape or part of the still life. And so that's what I have for you today.
So now we're going to switch to another local talent, Nekisha Durrett, another artist that as soon as I saw her work, I knew I wanted to live with it somehow, and it was just waiting for the right work. So I felt a connection with this series because as a historian, I wanted something that would always remind me of the incredibly weird year we've lived through. We're still living with the trauma, but 10 years from now, you know, how are we going to feel about this year of pandemic, of the explosion of Black Lives Matter, of protests, of the insurrection, and just so much that I think is sort of encapsulated in this brilliant series. And it also appealed to me as an art historian because I did a lot of work on the Cuban artist Ana Mendieta. And Mendieta actually made a series of drawings on leaves, on real leaves. Not very many of them survive. It may even have been this kind of leaf. They weren't well conserved and they became brittle, and a lot of them are gone. But she also, tragically and ironically, as one of her last works of art, made a sort of a lithograph portfolio artist book with her then husband, Carl Andre. And she chose as her shape for the lithographs as a leaf. So hers is a series of arrangements of leaves. And so I like both of those connections with the series, and Nekisha is going to tell us more about it. So we're going to start with a film clip.
Yeah, and I'll just talk over the film clip. Several years ago, I was visiting a friend who had this beautiful, huge magnolia tree in her yard, and I remarked on how beautiful the tree was, and her response was, "Oh, I want to get rid of that tree because I can't. These leaves, I just don't know what to do with these leaves." So she was thinking more about how to destroy these leaves because they're so rigid and they withstand weather and time. So fast forward to around May, about a year ago, I was in a cemetery in my neighborhood, Rock Creek Church Cemetery, and I noticed a gigantic magnolia tree. I started to look at these leaves in a very different way. I think about like before the tragic death of George Floyd a year ago. I think about how difficult it was for the names of Black people who had been murdered by police, how to keep those names kind of etched in one's memory. I kind of visualize it as sort of the name kind of floating on this wave that eventually just kind of drifts out of our periphery. And the pandemic afforded this time where we could really kind of sit with all of these, Tatiana Jefferson, who was murdered in 2019 in October, Ahmaud Arbery in February of 2020, and then Breonna Taylor in March of 2020, and then George Floyd in May. And so finally, the collective is kind of is sitting with the tsunami of these names. So one thing that I always notice is how even more fleeting the names of Black women who have been murdered by police, Black women, girls, and femmes, how they are largely left out of these conversations around police brutality and the anti-Black racism and white supremacy that undergirds this violence. I needed something small to work with because I no longer had access to my studio and I had a show coming up. I remembered that I had collected one of these magnolia leaves like several years ago and just kind of kept it on my desk and kind of watched how it behaved over time. And I noticed that it really didn't change that much from the time that it had fallen from the tree and the years later that it was just sitting there on my desk. So I think these are different leaves than Anna Mendiata was using. And also while I'm sitting with this leaf, I'm kind of looking at these little holes that are in the leaf that little beetles have kind of, eaten through. And then, there actually was kind of like a little bit of humor in that for me, like just thinking about like, what if, if a beetle could write a sentence or could speak, or how would it try to communicate to us through this, through the leaf, like through biting a pattern through the leaf. And so I acquired this paper and leather punch tool. And I would take these walks to the cemetery and I would collect leaves. I would just kind of in the middle of doing a lot of research around dozens of names of women who had been murdered. And I would create a digital graphic of the name, apply a halftone dot filter to the name and print it out on my home printer. And then I would tape the leaf to the surface, tape the the stencil to the surface of the leaf and punch the holes with the respective nib on the paper punch. So what I was left with was this, this leaf that, unless it's held up to the light, you can't make out what is actually inscribed on the leaf. And I started photographing these leaves, and I just used my iPhone to shoot this, and in Photoshop, added the magic of Photoshop, added some shadows and reflections, and begot a digital print. So what you saw in those other installation shots were the actual leaves that were encased in light boxes that I designed and had built with the help of a wonderful framer. And the boxes are actually lined with velvet. And I saw the leaves as, I saw the boxes as being a way of caring for these women after they were brutally murdered. A lot of times these women were reaching out to police for assistance, or they were in mental health crisis, and this phone call to the police ended in their tragic death. I guess the halftone, just to speak about for all the printmaking nerds that are out there. I worked in a graphic shop for a while at the Smithsonian. And while all my friends were like in New York and LA, kind of making a name for themselves, I was kind of toiling away in this graphic shop. And so I had to sort of justify what I was doing in some way. So I became really curious about the ways in which artists would support themselves working in print shops, and just having these jobs that were tangentially related to what they were doing in the studio, and how those things, those practices that they picked up in these other professions kind of found their way through their work. And, I think about Ed Ruscha, who was a sign painter and a metal typesetter, and, also Roy Lichtenstein, who worked in printmaking. And so I was printing these large scale graphics using a wide format digital printer, where, you would never see all the tiny dots that make up the digital print, because it's designed so that you don't see that. But I eventually, over the years when I left that work, I became interested in bringing, kind of doing away with that illusion and bringing forward the artifacts of silkscreen printing, those things that you're not supposed to see in a print. And so I found this image of James Baldwin on the internet, and it was kind of an old image. It had been degraded over time. It probably was a copy of a copy of a copy of an image. And then I took that image, applied this halftone dot filter to it. And so there is this breaking down of the image. And then I built the image back up with these handmade clay sculptures. So each halftone dot is represented by a clay dot that's then painted a couple of times and applied to to the panel. So yeah, and speaking about the light boxes again, as it relates to silk screen, I kind of had this panicked moment, like the night before I was going to mount that show. And it occurred to me that I was going to be asking visitors to stare into this light to see the leaves. And I thought, oh my God, like that might be a little uncomfortable. But then as I sat with that for a while, like conceptually, it kind of worked. You know, I think about what happens optically when you stare into a light. When you stare at an object against the light, you end up with this seeing this after image when you close your eyes, because it kind of etches, the image gets etched onto your retina temporarily. And so that was exactly kind of what I wanted to do with this work. You know, even when you look away, you still see the names of these women. You know, it's like a silk screen that that's coated in emulsion that's been exposed by the light. And sometimes, you know, an old silk screen still has remnants of a stain of an older image. So it's kind of this kind of roadmap of where the screen has been.
Wonderful. So that's our last slide.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and hold on. Okay, Zoom. Okay, thank you so much. This was fabulous. I have to say, I'm very impressed with your collection, Laura. I've had the privilege of seeing a lot of it in person, and I hope that you will indeed have us back in person. It really is spectacular.
Art is always better in person.
It is. And I have to say also, I so am impressed with your devotion to collecting art from local artists in the DMV. Chris and I certainly share that, and I know many others in the print club do focus on local artists because we have a spectacular arts community in this area. Spectacular, as proven by Julie and Nekisha. Perfect. So thank you so much. And now we do have a few questions, and I wanted to start with, hold on. Shelley Langdale asks Nekisha, are the actual leaf works conceived as an installation, all of a piece? And are you selling the prints as individual works, or are you also selling the individual leaves? Just curious, because the grouping you show in the installation with the binder of information is very powerful in itself, but seeing the works individually and calling out the individuality of each name is also meaningful. It's an incredible project. Nekisha?
Thank you, Shelley. Yes, so the prints and the actual leaves encased in the light boxes are available individually. And I do see them, you know, yeah, you can buy them, you know, as just a singular frame, or you could purchase a group of them. I do, when I conceived of the installation, I actually was imagining like a large wall where all of the leaves would kind of, you know, fill one wall, like a dark room. And so the leaves would like illuminate the space. The Cody Gallery allowed for a different configuration, which I think did work in the end. I would like to fully realize having them all together on one wall. But there's something nice about being able to get up close to all of the leaves. They're all kind of, you can stand on your tiptoes to see the ones at the top, or they're at eye level. So you can really see the beauty and delicate nature of each one of the leaves, which are all obviously very different.
Thank you, Nekisha. I'm looking, there's one comment here that this is nothing to do with the presentation, but I want to bring it up before I forget. Someone in the chat suggested that we mention the Mellon lectures, which are now on view at the NGA. And Shelley, you're probably the best person to do that if you can. I think most people are aware of them because it's on prints, but I'm just in case, could you just give a brief description?
Sure. Jennifer Roberts, who's a well-known art historian, has particular expertise in Jasper Johns prints, but is by her own self-definition not a print historian. Although she has focused a lot of her work on printmaking. Her biggest project was the Jasper Johns monotype catalog that she did. But she's taken a very interesting approach to her lectures on printmaking, where she has focused sort of on different physical or conceptual aspects of making prints. So contact, reversal, imprint, things like that. And actually I was thinking about it, probably the person who raised that was the same person who may have had the same reaction to Julie Wolfe's mention of how she liked the idea of the monotype and the transfer rather than painting directly on the surface. And so Jennifer's really exploring all those kinds of conceptual ideas about printmaking too. What does it mean to transfer an image? What kinds of conceptual ideas does that bring up? In terms of impression, memory, all of those kinds of things. So they're a really interesting series of lectures. I think there's one more coming up this coming weekend, and there were, I believe, 6 in all. It's going to come out as a book. Her scripts are going to be put into chapters and added to, and then it will be coming out in a book probably in about a year or so. But they are all recorded, so we encourage you to go on to the website. I'll post the link in the chat, or I guess Nancy already has. And I encourage you to look at them. And just a quick mention, because I don't want to take up too much time. I'm also working on hopefully having some kind of discussion with Jennifer at the IFPDA print fair in the fall, because one of the things that she's really struggled with as we all continue to have these virtual events is that she can't have questions in the moment from her audience. So if you're interested and you have compelling questions, stay tuned, because we're hopefully going to have a forum where we can have more discussion about all of that. Thanks, Beverly, for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful series of lectures, and the first and one that we've ever seen so extensively on prints. Imagine that. So Bruce Waxman asked Laura, your collection is so eclectic. When you are decorating at home, how do you decide what to hang, and how often do you rotate the collection that is displayed?
Well, like many collectors, we can't stop buying new prints. So we're always adding, and I do rotate. I'm in the process of kind of rehanging things and absorbing more from my parents' collection now. Just like considerations, there are certain works, like they had a Warhol flower print that is not on display because I don't want it to fade. I love, living with art, and it changes over time. I'm a curator, so the curator side of me is always thinking of new arrangements, new relationships between works of art. And we don't just have prints, we also have paintings and sculpture. And so since I grew up surrounded by a lot of contemporary art, it just always feels natural to me to be surrounded myself when I'm in someone's home where there's nothing on the walls, I feel, anxious, like there's something wrong here. So I'm very fortunate to have so much wonderful art that I've inherited, and my husband and I are fortunate that we are able to continue buying art and adding to that. And so it's a constantly changing mix, just like it would be in a gallery or a museum.
Thank you. My husband, Chris, has a question or two, so I'm going to let him pose them. Because he's right here.
I don't mean to horn in, but I had one question for Laura and one for Nekisha and Julie. And I'll ask Nekisha and Julie first, and that is, how much time do you put in to the creation of a work? Because when we, as viewers, look at it, we think, oh, that makes sense, and what a great idea, but we have no idea what the trial and effort and how much time went in to actually coming up with the idea and with the final product. So do you have any sense on how much time you put into working on it and then actually producing the final image?
So yeah, it's something that's almost, it's kind of difficult to determine how long it takes. Cause like, if I think about the moment I had that conversation with my friend about her magnolia tree, I mean, that was like maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And then just kind of holding on to that thought, and then there's the moment when I find a leaf and decide to pick it up and to keep it in my studio for a few years and just see what happens to it. And then waiting for the potential of this thing to be revealed. So all of that is like a span of multiple years. And then, there's the moment of, actually creating it. That, I guess that whole summer, from May until I think classes started in August, I was working on that project, making about 2 or 3 leaves a day, and just working on that alone.
Mm-hmm.
Julie, did you want to mention something, or?
Julie, I think you're muted.
Oh.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, what Nekisha is talking about too, it's like it can take years, and it also is really hard to track the amount of time that you spend. You may get an idea in your head and maybe write about it or do research or sketch for a year, or maybe it just sort of, goes in your files and you refer to it when it seems like the time is right. And then developing the idea conceptually and visually, the working out of that is important, and it can take time. And then there's that morning you wake up and it's like coming to fruition in your head or physically. The book that I showed you, for example, that took me probably 4 months, but before that I had spent years making photographs and also learning the techniques. Like that one was stab bound with linen and how to, do a French fold book. So it always has a history to it. But then also something that I think is really magical about each artist works in such an individual way. And so that's a great question, because I love to find out, just visit studios and learn about the works in progress, what the practice is. So it varies widely, but also once you have the idea and you're happy with it and you start making it, that's like the best day of your life. It's like, it is a magical moment. And so once you start working, then, like Nekisha did, you make one, and then that one, sort of feeds into another, and then another, and then you have a series. And sometimes you use that as reference for the next project. And I think also that gives your work more like consistency too, which is always interesting to see. But yeah, so that's, it is hard to put amount of time on it. But that doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if it takes, it's if you're happy with it and it feels right. And, of course, it's nice to see other people respond to it as well. So.
Well, it's nice to have that kind of background, because most of us, when we look at the art that's on the wall, we never think about the years, the time, the process that goes on behind it. So it's nice that both of you could add some sort of background as to the complexities lying behind what you actually create. And I wanted to just turn a question to Laura. You and your husband collect, as do Beverly and I and others who are husband and wives. And I wonder, do you often agree on what to buy? And do you have any preferences for what you're looking for when you look to buy a work of art?
Well, I'm not sure if I should let my husband chime in on this, but as the person who actually works in the art field, I have to say I have a weighted vote in what we acquire. A lot of the decisions are mine, but I've learned a lot about politics and law from him over the decades, and he's learned a lot about art from me. So I would say he's become a great art appreciator himself. And I think we share the same values in wanting to buy Latinx artists, in wanting to support people of color, in wanting to support women. And we've acquired a lot of work along those lines over the years. So the last portfolio that we bought is a good example. The artist approached me and told me, we're doing this, and we're doing it to raise funds. And I immediately said, yes, we'll buy one. And then I got my husband involved in helping them to become, legally a nonprofit. So we do work as a team in that way.
I agree with Laura 100%. And that's all I'm going to say.
Well, you are a politician indeed.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're about ready to wind it up. Nancy, do you have a few words you want to say before we say goodbye?
Just to thank everyone for coming. It was a wonderful program. Thank you to Laura, Nekisha, Julie. Really appreciate your time and talents.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very appreciated.
Yes.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.